Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating and highly debated source analysis. We're looking at the geopolitical ripple effects of a reported new US-Iran deal. If you've been trying to wrap your head around the massive shifts happening in the Middle East right now, and honestly, how they might impact global stability, well, you are definitely in the right place. So according to the source material we're breaking down today, this entire agreement basically hinges on one number. 14. Yep, there are 14 specific points to this deal. But here's where the analysis makes a pretty staggering claim right out of the gate. It argues that a whopping 13 of these points heavily favor Iran, leaving just one single point in the United States column. Whether you see that as a diplomatic masterclass or a complete strategic misstep, the way these points break down is absolutely fascinating. To make sense of all this dense diplomatic maneuvering, we're going to group these 14 points into a few main themes: the surprising deal breakdown, military shifts, financial rebuilding, and the nuclear question. Then, we'll cap it off by looking at the regional fallout, specifically Israel's separate front, and how regional allies are reacting to the whole shebang. All right, let's jump right into part one, the surprising deal breakdown, and see exactly how the source categorizes this reported 13-1 victory for Iran. Instead of making us read through a grueling, super dry list of 14 separate clauses, the source neatly organizes these points into three distinct buckets. We've got military actions aimed at stopping troop movements, financial relief meant to unfreeze massive amounts of wealth, and nuclear capabilities to set boundaries on enrichment. Grouping it like this really helps us instantly grasp the sheer scale of what's supposedly on the negotiation table. Moving right along to our second section, let's look at the military and strategic shifts. The source highlights some immediate, really massive changes in military posturing between the two nations. So the source outlines a few immediate ground-level shifts: an outright ceasefire everywhere, an end to internal political interference, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade, and fully opening the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the analysis points out a really interesting caveat here. The U.S. might chalk up opening the strait as a big win for global shipping, right? But the source argues Iran actually wanted it open all along for their own business operations. They only closed it as a forced wartime measure. So a win-win or just an Iranian win? The source leans heavily toward the latter. And that naturally leads us right into section 3, financial rebuilding and sanctions. Because let's be real, if trade routes are opening back up, the money is definitely going to start flowing. To put this into perspective, the source points out that Iran holds roughly 12% of the entire world's oil and 16% of its natural gas reserves. That is a massive chunk of global resources. The analysis makes a really compelling argument here. Despite sitting on more natural wealth than a lot of the booming Gulf states, Iran's economy has been seriously struggling, mainly due to strict U.S. sanctions. Lifting those? Well, according to the source, it could transform the nation's economic standing practically overnight. But wait, it's not just about future oil revenue. The source cites reports from Al Jazeera stating that well over $100 billion, yes, billion with a B, in currently blocked Iranian funds would be released as a direct result of this deal. Just imagine that for a second. That is an immediate, absolutely massive injection of capital straight back into the Iranian economy. And the financial revelations actually don't stop there. The analysis draws a pretty bold historical parallel when looking at point 6 of the deal, which reportedly involves a $300 billion U.S. fund to rebuild a well-behaving Iran. The source actually compares this potential mega payout to the famous Marshall Plan, when the U.S. funded the rebuilding of Japan after World War II. According to the analysis, if the U.S. basically foots the bill to rebuild Iran's infrastructure, that cements an almost unbelievable economic victory for Tehran. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and head into section 4, the nuclear question, because this brings us to the one single component that the source identifies as a point favoring the United States. So this supposed U.S. win is Iran agreeing to never build a nuclear bomb. But the source points out some deep irony here. Iran's supreme leader actually issued a religious decree, a fatwa, 23 years ago, stating that building an atomic bomb is strictly forbidden by Islamic law. This isn't exactly a secret either. It's so well established in international diplomacy that former U.S. President Barack Obama even brought it up at the United Nations. The source essentially poses a tough question. Is it really a concession if they officially banned it themselves over 2 decades ago? Let's look at how this translates to the physical reality on the ground right now. To explain the current anxiety, the source breaks down uranium enrichment levels. Basically, 5% purity gets you civilian electricity. You need 90% to make a bomb. Currently, Iran is holding at about 60%. According to the analysis, this is a very deliberate tactic. It's not a bomb, but it's close enough to act as a highly effective intimidation tool against the US and Israel during these exact negotiations. Which brings us perfectly to Section 5, Israel's separate front. Because while the US and Iran are supposedly ironing out these 14 points, the source shifts our focus to the immediate ripple effect happening right next door. The analysis details a rapidly escalating situation here. It claims Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is absolutely furious over the prospect of this US-Iran deal. In response, the source says Israel initiated a separate, highly intense conflict. We're talking an escalation from drone and aircraft strikes on Lebanon to ground forces crossing the border, ultimately leading to territorial occupation and thousands of casualties. The picture the source paints is one of Israel aggressively expanding its military footprint, right while its primary ally is desperately trying to negotiate a ceasefire. And this leads to a super dramatic geopolitical twist. We're seeing reports, highlighted by the source, of Israeli parliamentary ministers openly criticizing the US government. At the same time, the US vice president is allegedly issuing threats right back at Israel to step down. The explainer really zeroes in on the stark irony here. Two allies who historically stood shoulder to shoulder against Iran are now publicly fracturing, all while Iran potentially walks away with a highly favorable deal. All right, let's move into our final section, Part 6, Regional Reactions and Allies, to see exactly how the broader Muslim world is responding to this massive power shift. According to the source, there is a massive disconnect right now between everyday public sentiment and actual state-level action. While the analysis claims the general public across the Muslim world heavily sides with Iran in this standoff, the geopolitical reality at the top is very different. On a state level, the source notes that only Qatar and Pakistan have offered actual support to Iran. Other regional Muslim nations either stood by completely neutral or actively opposed Iran's actions. The source even mentions that some famous Muslim figures and celebrities released statements against Iran. But get this, they allegedly had to disable their comment sections because the pro-Iran backlash from the general public was just too overwhelming. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground today, relying strictly on this source analysis of the 14-point agreement. We've seen claims of massive financial windfalls for Iran, strategic military shifts, and a severe fracturing of the US-Israel alliance. And so the source's breakdown leaves us with a really critical, provocative question to ponder. With the US and Israel at odds, and Iran potentially securing unprecedented wealth and military relief, are we witnessing the end of a war, or are we just watching the beginning of a totally unrecognizable Middle East? Think about how these new fault lines might redraw the map of global alliances. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how these 14 points play out in the real world.